State Supreme Court ruled that a lawsuit against CHI Health St. Francis Hospital must continue. Jillian Woodyard sued the hospital, claiming that her husband Brian suffered brain damage during an ER visit in 2019. Court records indicate that Woodyard had a swollen tongue and had trouble breathing. Doctors intubated Woodyard about 90 minutes after he arrived at the ER. She claims that her husband suffered brain damage during that time period. A lower court dismissed her lawsuit against the hospital, but today the Supreme Court overturned that decision, arguing that the trial judge failed to include 2 documents from medical experts. The case now goes back to Hall County District Court. Brian Woodyard died in 2022. His wife does not blame the hospital for his death, but she does claim the hospital and the group of doctors who treated him are responsible for the brain damage.